before you do it, you want any idea of about what's...
No, I think.
Okay, we'll do it later or not at all. Doesn't matter
No,
to me.
we'll let it be part of the interview. It'll be a surprise for me.
Well, you want to start? Well, I don't know what you want, but do you want me to?
Well, I'm gonna ask
give you a
some,
brief outline of my career.
I'm gonna
As
ask
military, or you want to talk about the governor? What?
No, we'll follow some questions here.
Okay,
that I've got.
okay, good.
Let me do this. This tape is part of the Middle Tennessee Oral History Collection, designated as MT 2000.041. This is Betty Rowland. Today is Tuesday, April 17th, 2001. I'm interviewing Bill Pickron at his home located at 802 North Rutherford Boulevard. And I'm going to make a correction. This tape is designated as MT 2000.042, I believe. The tape of this interview, along with the transcription of the interview, will become part of the MTSU Oral History Collection and will be available to the public. Future researchers may include portions of this interview in their publications. And you've signed the paper. Is that all right with you, Mr.
That's
Pickron?
fine.
Okay. So we'll get started with some stuff for the record.
All right.
I'd like your full name.
William Henry Pickron, Jr.
Okay. And your date of birth.
7th of March, 1923.
Okay. And your place of birth?
McCauley, Texas.
Where is McCauley, Texas?
About 40 miles from Abilene.
Okay.
Dry country.
And your father's name?
William H. Pickron, Sr.
What was his occupation?
It varied. He worked seasonal job for 30-some odd years, and later had another seasonal job. In the off-season, he rebuilt houses. He was a painter, tried farming. This was back in the Depression days. Those days, in the off-season, he'd work for $1 a day. Wasn't very good money, but no one else had any money. So that's the background I was raised in.
Do you remember the Depression?
Very well. My part of it. Everybody was poor that I knew, but it didn't seem to bother them.
Because it was pretty much general.
Right. Well, I came from a very small town, and wasn't anyone made much money there.
Yeah.
But they all went to church, and they all liked one another. Good place to grow up.
Well, that's good. What was your mother's name?
Willie Ellen.
And what was her occupation?
Housewife.
Stayed at home and raised family.
Right.
Brothers and sisters?
None.
None.
No.
Only child.
Only child.
Well, you had a lot of time with Mom then,
Oh,
didn't
yes.
you? That's good. And your wife's name?
Her name is Leland Bess Darden, prior to marriage, and we were raised on the same block.
Oh, really?
And we never went together until I'd gone overseas, my first overseas tour, and came back, and she'd grown up. We were friends all these other years, and did things together. We would play many sets of tennis together on the weekends, so forth.
She looked, she had a little more appeal when she grew up, I guess.
I suppose so. She's not here, so I can say that. But we got married during the war, so we've been married going on 57 years in August.
Oh, my goodness.
My first wife's still giving me trouble.
You said she left because she's heard all these stories.
Right.
Tell me how you entered the service. What set of events brought you to
Well,
the service?
In early 1941, we were still being affected by the Depression. And there wasn't any free college programs or any help for college. My father couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford it. So my primary purpose in life at that time was to be a pilot.
You already knew that.
I already knew that.
How did you determine
that? I
that?
had nothing but airplanes hanging from the ceiling of my room from the time I was about 10 years old. But anyhow, there wasn't much hope of being a pilot, so I got into the service as a buck private in the Army Air Corps. That's back before it became the Air Force.
How old were you?
I was 18 in 1 week. I had to be 18 and had to have my parents sign an agreement, which that wasn't very easy to get. But it wasn't long before I got a small promotion and kept going along. And in July, they had an experimental test for pilots. And prior to that, and they'd always have to have 2 years of college before they could apply, and had to be 21 before they could graduate to receive a commission. Well, I was only 18, but they foresaw the fact that they could not get enough pilots if we got into war that had the college requirement, because in those days not everyone went to college. Very few people did, in fact. Anyhow, they gave a written exam to 1,500 people in the Gulf Coast states and picked 150 to go through an experimental class. And this experimental class turned out to be the flying sergeants, enlisted pilots. And you graduated as a staff sergeant with a guarantee in 1 year to be a tech sergeant, in 3 years a master sergeant. And in the Depression, that was an ideal position. It paid good money compared to anything else. And you had a career, and at the end of 20 years or more, you could retire with a certain amount of money. That looked good, and especially in being able to fly. I would have flown for nothing, you know, just feed me. So
you took the test?
Pardon? I took the test, and I was one of the people selected. And at the time, on $21 a month, I was spending $5 for gasoline to fly in a little 40-horse airplane with a friend of mine that owned it on the weekends. And I was going to business school at night in San Antonio, all on $21 a month.
Why were you going to business school?
I wanted to start getting an education.
Okay.
And figured that that would be the first thing to get. But I was entering the final phase of training, and Pearl Harbor came along. And they expedited training, and I was just barely 19 when I got my wings. And at that time, they had me stand up in the graduating class as the youngest pilot in the Army Air Corps at the time.
Really?
And my first assignment, instead of overseas, was to Arizona, down in the desert. All they had was a runway that they'd paved, and the rest of it was hot sand. And they authorized us to wear cowboy boots, because otherwise the hot sand would go over the shoe top and scorch your feet. So that's one of the few things that ever happened in the Air Force. You were authorized to cowboy boots. That was quite unusual.
Well, tell me, before you got there, tell me what kind of training you went through. Now, you had never flown.
No. Number one, the cadets were the ones with the college. The aviation students who became sergeant enlisted pilots were the ones without any college. Some of them had some college, and it happened to be that they were kind of a sorted out group, that one man knew trig, another guy knew, it just went around. So we had our own ground school, personal training at night until about 10 o'clock every night among ourselves. And you might not recognize it, but the determination was much greater among us than I think anyone else. Our academic scores on graduation was 1 point or almost 2 points higher than the cadets of the college. And we received the identical training they got, the identical ground school and other trainings, as identical flying and everything else. And they graduated as second lieutenant, and we graduated as a sergeant. And within 3 months after I was out in Arizona, my first assignment, they decided that was going to work, so they lowered the requirement for cadets to no college. So here I was instructing a gentleman that was becoming an officer, a second lieutenant. while I was still a sergeant. And it took them about 6 more months to ever get around to saying, hey, well, these guys have got the same qualifications. Maybe we ought to give them a commission, because we're commissioning other people that didn't even have to take the test that these guys took. So that's how we progressed up the line.
Tell me about your first experiences flying. You'd been wanting to fly since you were 10.
I had a very unusual experience the first solo flight I took. We didn't have runways in those days, and we had these open cockpit, 2-wing Stearman aircraft. And the instructor shotted through a tube to you. And you got so much instruction, dual instruction on how to fly, how to take off and land, to do certain aerial maneuvers. And when he thought you were competent, he allowed you to go by yourself. Now, we didn't have the runways. We had great big grass fields. And the procedure would be land or take off and go to the end of the field before you turn, because you had planes taking off and landing all the way around in the same direction. My first takeoff by myself, I was about a third of the way down the field, just almost getting flying speed, and another plane landed beside me and passed and then turned directly in front of me. And I tried to get it off the ground. It wouldn't come off the ground. It'd just get up a little bit and fall back down. So I pushed the controls forward as hard as I could and bounced over the plane on the other side. And went on and took off and did the rest of the flight, come back and landed. And that was my first flight. Everything else after that particularly was routine training.
The problem was just getting off getting past that plane.
Well, anyhow, it was interesting.
I'm sure it was.
I spent the next year volunteered about 6 times to get overseas. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to get in the war.
Is this while you were in Arizona?
Pardon?
Are you in Arizona during this time that you're volunteering?
Yes, down in the desert, instructing.
In your cowboy boots.
In my cowboy boots, instructing other people to become pilots, and at the same time, in the later part of their training, before they got their wings, instructing them in aerial gunnery with a fighter, and ground gunnery and ground bombing and strafing.
Why did you want to be a fighter pilot?
Well, to me, that was more appealing and more... a fighter pilot, there's nothing wrong with the bomber pilots. There's the one that really won the war by dropping all the bombs. But the fighters are used for their protection mainly, and then later on, the end of the war, last part of the war, the fighters carried a lot of bombs themselves and did a lot of damage that way. Why I wanted to be a fighter pilot is there's a little difference, I think, in the attitude. A bomber pilot has a crew maybe anywhere from 4 to 10 people, and he's got someone to do this, someone to do that. We did our own navigation, our own gun controls. We did fuel management. Everything was up to you. You depended only on yourself.
How many crew members would be on a fighter pilot?
Fighter, one.
Just one?
Just
one
one.
person by themselves?
And it was interesting in checking out in the fighter those days. Today they have 2-seaters. Instructors riding in a seat, and dual seat. Fighters are all single seat, basically. But they built dual seaters, a few, just to check people out. They didn't have those in World War II. You got a briefing, then you got in the cockpit, started the engine and left. And every flight was a first. So it was quite different.
Yes, I can imagine.
But a fighter pilot, I liked the independence of it. And the other thing about a fighter pilot, a bomber flies straight and level. A fighter pilot is bottom side up, straight down, spinning, loops. It's a wonderful feeling.
Oh, it makes me just a little seasick. Or air sick, I guess.
But these are things that are necessary. If someone is shooting at you, you can't just sit there and let him shoot at you. You've got to outmaneuver him.
And you enjoyed
Oh, I enjoyed it.
the
Well, I
maneuvering.
really enjoyed it. And,
how did How did you become a fighter pilot then?
Pardon?
How did you become the fighter
Well, when you
pilot?
graduated, you put in a preference. From Kelly Field, one of the oldest fields in the United States Air Force, they picked 11 of us to go to Arizona. I'd say over 90% went to bombers, or transport, carrying supplies. And just nearly all of my classmates were in that category. But fortunately, I got what I wanted. And I continued on from there. After a year, I volunteered for about the 6th time and got to go overseas. Things weren't as organized maybe in those days, and you've heard of the government doing odd things. The Air Force or the Army at the time did the same thing. They trained me for 2 or 3 weeks in escape invasion and desert survival. So we knew we were going to one place at that time. That would be North African campaign. Well, that was great. In those days, you had sealed orders. You could not open the orders until you got so far out over the ocean or away from the United States, and then you open them. That way it was security, see? In other words, you didn't open them and lay them on your desk or table at home.
Yeah.
They had changed our orders, and incidentally, think about this, we were in khaki clothes, that's all we had, and here we were flying across to Europe. I think it was to be to Scotland and then England and on down to Africa. Opened the orders, and they'd changed our orders to Iceland. And obviously they need somebody assigned to Iceland. So they changed our orders. So we froze for the next week or two when we landed because we didn't have anything but khakis on.
Because you thought you'd be in a warmer climate?
Oh, yes. Well, that was all everything we'd ever been told. Iceland was a refueling point for bombers flying overseas. And they came over by the thousands. And they had to have a fighter base to protect just in case the Germans want to come back and get the island. I stayed there for 14 months. Finally got down to London and had an opportunity to come home. And there wasn't any rotation policy in those days, so I took it. I was home 6 months and then went to Pacific. And I was there the last year of the war, and Okinawa campaign, some out of the Marshall Islands and so forth. One interesting thing, a fighter didn't have the range of a bomber, and for a long time they couldn't reach Berlin, for example, in Europe, until they made a long-range fighter. But these fighters were short range compared to the one they had built for special operation in Pacific. So I had a brand new fighter when I went to Pacific.
What was that fighter?
It was a P-47N model. It looked like the regular short range model, except it might be a little larger with a larger engine, and it carried a lot more fuel. And where maybe they would have a 6-hour range, this one had a 10-hour range and 2,500 mile, 10 hours in time, but 2,500 miles in distance. So we picked him up in Hawaii and flew him across the Pacific Ocean. That's a big ocean. We made, I think it's 4 refueling stops, either 3 or 4. And that was one of the first times I'd ever flown a single engine across the Pacific Ocean. And a lot of water out there.
Tell me about some of your
Pardon?
Tell me about some of your experiences,
Well,
if you don't mind.
in Iceland, combat wasn't a big thing because we didn't have much. The first plane shot down in World War II, after we got in World War II, after Pearl Harbor, was in Iceland. But the Germans had Norway. And from Norway, they would send reconnaissance planes over Iceland. And when I first got there, we had the obsolete Flying Tiger airplane, the old P-40. It was slow. It was a good airplane, but it was outclassed, and the Germans could outrun it. The other thing the Germans were doing at that time, was bombing shipping. The shipping lane from the United States Lend-Lease shipping lane to Russia went just north of Iceland. And they would fly over and bomb it. And so they put an attachment of us up on the northern end of Iceland, a little short strip. And the intelligence of the Germans was fantastic. In fact, I'd say that a fairly large percent of the Icelanders were pro-German. So they knew our names, they knew when we took off and when they landed. And the other part of the Icelanders accepted us, but they were right remote at this time of the game. I think today it's all different. But they put us up on the northern end of the island, and so when the people would come over, we'd get airborne and they'd leave. We couldn't catch them. But it got to the point where if we were flying, they didn't come. If the weather wasn't that good for us, here they came. So it was cat and mouse game. And there were a few shot down, but that was after got later fighters. The biggest problem in Iceland was the weather. You could have 3 or 4 different kinds of weather in an hour and a half or 2 hour period of flying. If you go out, you might come back and fog rolled in and you couldn't see the place to land. So you were fortunate to get in. You'd get right down on the water and get to the edge of the coast and know a known landmark and sneak in. But it was really interesting, and we didn't have any modern facilities in those days like you have today. And radar was highly undependable, and 2 or 3 times you'd fly out of radar range, and they had vectored you so many places, and you were over clouds, so of course all you could see is water anyhow, that you become lost. And then you have to fly a lost pattern, which is kind of a ever-increasing square, hoping that one of those legs will hit land. And if you have enough fuel, you make it. But twice when I landed, I ran out of fuel before I could get to the ramp to taxi in.
My goodness.
Things were real close.
That was close.
The other thing that would happen, you have very terrific high winds during a certain part of the year. And believe it or not, planes set in a revetment, the fighters, and it was high enough wind at times it'd be rotating the propellers. Now that's getting high, up 70 and 80 and 90 miles an hour.
That would be difficult flying.
Pardon?
That would be difficult to fly in.
We wouldn't fly in those times.
Couldn't.
But being high winds, you've got to realize that most of Iceland is glacier and lots of jagged edges. And we had several guys that bailed out and the wind dragged them to death before they got out of their parachute. That's before they had the quick release parachute. Nowadays you have all you just push on one place on the parachute release, and everything turns loose and you can't be dragged to death. But we lost several guys that had to bail out and was drugged to death before they could get out of their parachute. So fighting the elements was much worse than anything else.
Really? Did you ever have to bail out of your plane?
In 38 years of flying, I never jumped out of an airplane.
That's great.
I would kind of, I think I might getting too old to do it, but I kind of like to try it one time.
Oh, goodness.
I've parasailed, I've done things like that. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, was your experience different in the Pacific?
Well, quite a bit. Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, the Okinawa campaign was one of the bloodiest they ever had. Lots of people killed in that campaign. We got there during the tail end of it, but we were there long enough to see quite a bit of action. And we weren't on Okinawa. We considered it Okinawa. We were about a half a mile offshore on a little island that was a mile wide and a mile and a half long. And when we landed, they had just completed, the Seabees had just completed a strip, one strip, and some taxiways on one end of the island. And they were still snipers at night shooting through the tents, so you couldn't have a light on. And let's see. One thing, Ernie Pyle was a reporter in World War II. He was a very famous reporter, and he was killed on this runway the week before we got there, while they were building the runway. And he was buried there in a little island of Ieshima. That's pronounced Ieshima, and it's I-E, capital I-E, and then Shima for island, S-H-I-M-A. But anyhow, one thing that was interesting, flying across the Pacific, some of these legs from point to point to landing to the next were quite long. And our longest one was 1,850 miles, and that was from Guam to Okinawa, or Ieshima. We thought that was a long mission. Our first mission was to the capital of Korea, direct across the waters. It was 2,000-mile round trip, and we stayed over the target for 45 minutes. That was quite a mission. So our missions ran anywhere from, maybe I'd say 5 hours to 9 hours in one seat, and you're sitting on a hard-packed life raft. We hit targets in Formosa, Shanghai, China, Seoul, Korea, the whole southern island, Japan, and about halfway to Tokyo. And this fighter carried more. It was the largest single-engine fighter the Army Air Force had during World War II. And as I recall, it weighed just around 15,000 pounds, sitting on the ramp empty, and on takeoff it's a little over 25,000 pounds. And that's nothing today, but then it was quite a heavy airplane for a single engine. But it was speedy, it was fast, wasn't as maneuverable maybe, but it had the speed. And the armament it carried was interesting. You carried 1,000-pound napalm, or instantaneous high explosive, 1,000-pound bomb on one wing and one under the other. That's two. We carried 10 5-inch rockets under the wings and 4,200 and some odd rounds of 50 caliber ammunition with 8 guns. So this would cut down a wall. They'd cut down a brick wall in just one pass. Just the guns alone.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there someone on the plane to operate the guns?
The pilot. He sat in one seat and he did everything.
The pilot did the gunnery too?
Yes.
So my experience is based on movies, and I thought there was some...
You have a gun sight up here.
Oh.
Of course, you have to arm all the switches, and you have to control the fuel flow to different, from tanks. You do your own navigating and all that. You got your maps folded on your knee and anchored.
Well, you didn't have time to get bored, even on a long mission. I mean, you had something constantly to be watching.
You generally had a sore neck.
Yeah.
And you may have seen movies where the pilot's got this flowing white scarf. We wore scarves, and the reason being that you're wearing a life raft, a Mae West to call them, around your neck, in case you jumped out in the ocean. And you're constantly looking back here because that's where somebody's going to be if they shoot at you. They're not going to come up head on where you can see them. So you're moving your neck continually. So you need a scarf or something there to keep from rubbing it raw. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason for the scarf.
Well, I just...
It's not really Hollywood. It's a necessity.
I thought it was a Hollywood thing.
I'll show you one in here in a minute if you want to see it.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to.
The targets, this was around the end of the war, see. Several months before the end of the war. Some of the life in the camp might be interesting. We lived in tents, and the food wasn't very appealing, believe me. We didn't have these current day modern meals, packed meals in a minute they call them. We ate Spam. If you ever ate Spam in a 110-degree temperature, standing out in the sun with a mess kit in your hand, you would eat it broiled, you eat it baked, you eat it fried, any way in the world, but it becomes horrible.
No way to make it good, huh?
And I had a habit of eating it and upchucking soon thereafter. And I went from 178 pounds down to 138 in a period of 2.5 months. And a might interesting story might be
All right, you were going to tell me an interesting story about the food.
about the food, right. I lost all this weight and we were getting hungry. And things are different then. They weren't like they are today, because when we closed down this complete unit in the States, they closed the bar down, which is today would be illegal taking it overseas, but we packed it in crates and called it personal equipment, like it was flying gear, you know.
And what was that?
Booze.
Oh, okay.
All
the bar.
kinds of whiskey.
Oh, okay.
Gin. Well, I didn't drink, but my ration was 1/5 every 2 weeks. So I was over in Okinawa, and I'd had this fifth, and I happened to run into a Army private, and he wasn't reluctant to turn loose of his Jeep, so I traded the fifth for a Jeep, put it on the barge, and took it back home. And that's better than walking. And the wing commander was a bird colonel, and he got to understand that I was a first lieutenant. That's kind of like God, you know.
A bird colonel?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Then, maybe not today, but then. So we never parked together. We never ran around together, although we were friends, and I had known him overseas before. He'd been my commander in the past. That's why I was with this unit, because he handpicked me. But I painted his serial numbers on the Jeep, and we never parked in the same place, naturally. So if they were looking for a lost Jeep, they weren't going to find it. So we had a private Jeep for my flight. And I did get hungry, and I'd take a fifth of booze, which I didn't drink, go out to a Navy ship, usually a big one, parked in the harbor. They had refrigeration. They ate like a king, as long as they had the food. But I could trade that fifth for 5 frozen T-bone steaks and 2 boxes of cigars. And I love to smoke cigars. I even carried them in the airplane. But, you know, 5 T-bone steaks in that condition is worth a fortune.
Must have been.
One side story with this Jeep. Every time we got hungry, we tried to do something about it. And they had this island's only a 1.5 miles long that we were on. They had 350 fighters on it. So one night we took the Jeep and went to this big supply dump and found a crate about 6 feet long and 2 feet each direction on the sides, put it on the back of the Jeep, started out. We heard the MP, "Halt!" Well, we had the lights off and we knew the way out of where we was going, so we ran like a dickens and they were chasing us. We made a sudden turn to a little side road and they kept going. Got back to the camp and put the flaps down on the tent, lit a candle. You still couldn't have a light because snipers would shoot through the tent. So we shielded the candle, opened it. It was, I can't recall now, it was an enormous amount of canned turkey, white meat. We lived like a king for about a month and a half or 2 months.
So you had your own private stash.
Absolutely.
Well,
We ran out of that and we tried it again. Went back. This is dark now. Same area. And by this time, the supply was enormous. They were planning on the invasion of Japan. So everything was being stocked. Man, you couldn't imagine how much was there. But same area, we found a crate. We put it on the Jeep. Halt. They hollered again, you know, and this time we did the same thing. And in slow motion, the Jeep turned over as we rounded that corner and they went on down the road. Well, we jumped out and we got a skinned knee and we rolled the Jeep back up, got in it and went back, lowered the temp flaps, lit the candle, opened it. And I don't know, you can edit this out if you want to. It was, I think, 144 cartons of prophylactic kits.
oh,
We slipped those into each tent that night, and next morning in the chow line, all you could hear was, you know, the invasion's on, the invasion's on. They're issuing these things right now. You know?
so you
One
didn't.
other time in the chow line, you remember now, we got up and ate about 4:30 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Still dark. And we had 45 caliber pistols. We always wore these things. And there was a pilot in front of me, a friend, that he looked kind of like, you imagine Charles Atlas, fearless. He let out a scream I wouldn't believe. He said, "Who's got a pistol? Who's got a pistol?" I said, "Here." There was a little Japanese that had come out of a cave and starving to death, and he was standing in the line trying to get food. And this guy was scared to death, so we captured the Japanese. Odd little things happen. As you can set your clock by bedtime Charlie. We call it bedtime Charlie because this was a Japanese plane would come over at night, drop one 500-pound bomb, and you set your clock. It'd come over at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning to disrupt your sleep. Seldom hit anything, except one night it burned up 15 of our fighters.
Well,
So-
as small as the island was, I would think that repeated trips
Yes.
twice a night.
Well, we
would-
might get something occasionally,
Uh-huh.
but our planes are on one end and we slept down near the ocean on the other end, so I don't think one ever hit an account. But when I first got there, I was kind of a novice, and first night one came over. I might back up a little bit. Do you know, you dig these trenches, and those are what you'll jump into in case they're bombing, and they'd have to hit a very small area to get you. So that's a trench that you save for just that purpose. Well, also somewhere in the area is another trench. It takes the place of a latrine. Well, the first time that happened, I rushed out to go to this trench and wasn't just sure where it was, and I got there and they said, "Well, this thing's full, just go over to the other one." So I went over there and jumped in, and it wasn't the right trench. It was the latrine. After that,
You were
more or
careful.
less, we pretty well just rolled over in the bed and continued sleeping.
I guess so. I guess it got to be commonplace if it happened every night.
Very common. When I first got there, in fact, I've got picture over here. The kamikaze planes they sunk a whole lot of ships. And I've got a picture of one going directly down and hitting a ship.
Now, the kamikaze planes are the planes where
Japanese
the
suicide planes.
pilots go down
Yeah.
with the planes.
And some of them looks like a flying bomb with a wing on it. And there's a little airfield over there. It's a big one now, I think, called Naha. That was over on the main island. And this one Japanese suicide pilot decided he didn't want to carry through, and he belted the little plane in. And that at the end of the war, that thing was sitting over on display. So that's the only one I ever saw close up. But
Do you know how those pilots were selected for that? Were they volunteers? Would you know?
Probably were. I've seen a film on the History Channel. It's interesting, and it was talking about this particular squadron that was trained, and it was considered a great honor. And of course, in their belief at that time, he was already assured of being among the great gods when he died. Mm-hmm. But that brings up an interesting story. We made missions on railroad stations, big railway yards to disrupt the transportation. We hit mines, sulfur mines they used in making ammunition and so forth. And we hit oil refineries and storage tanks of that nature, and numerous, anything military-wise, we normally, that's what we're hit. But down in the southern end of the island of Kyushu, that's the southern island that we were closest to, mm-hmm. was a little airfield down there, and this field was used. We never did catch any planes on it. We tried, but we didn't find any, not in the daytime. But this was one that the kamikazes used. They'd stage from inland and come down there late in the afternoon, refuel, and then come over at night, or this could be the latter part of the daylight period, and hit installations in Okinawa. So I'd made flights on this field and shot up anything that moved or anything that looked like it's worth shooting at several times. When we make a long flight inland on a target, then you have what's known as targets of opportunity. That's to come back and shoot at anything that moves out the whole country through several hundred miles, you know. And so we always wound up going by this place trying to hopefully catch a plane, sometime one in a hangar or something. But anyhow, looking at this film, that's the film that the kamikazes landed on and used. They staged it out of there coming down to Okinawa. Mm-hmm. It was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. There was might be worth mentioning, one of the top aces in World War II was Pappy Boyington. I think he was a Marine.
What was that last name?
Pappy, well, that's nickname. Last name was Boyington. And I don't remember the number, but he shot down a whole lot of planes before he was shot down and captured. And he was a prisoner in Japan. And we knew where the prison camps were. And anyhow, there was one down on the way home in the southern part of the island of Kyushu. And we used to take these cartons of cigarettes and put them in candy and stuff like that. And we would strafe up to the edge of the prison, roll bottom side up, open the canopy, and drop all this stuff out on the place where the prisoners were. And what was interesting about this particular one is, let's see, the war was, can't remember now, it was either the 14th of August or close thereby. Anyhow, 1 and 2 days before the war was ceased, in other words, they stopped all movement, we had a mission, and we flew over this place, and on top of one of the barracks, it says, Pappy Boyington is here. And later I met him out here at the Smyrna Air Show. I said, I told him who I was, and he's rather a gruff individual. And I said, by the way, did you ever get any of those cigarettes and food that we dropped on you the latter part of the war? Yeah, we got some, but you was too damn late. That was his attitude. And I said, well, thank you, goodbye.
What happened?
I tell you, the prison camps there must have been horrible, because Japanese are different people today, but the people then, in my opinion, were, well, I didn't like them, naturally. That's the way we were taught, but they were quite horrible on the prisoners, as I understand. talking to people that were in prison.
You know, I've interviewed some people and talked to them about the prisoner of war camp that was at Camp Forest, and they had German prisoners there. But I mean, they were treated so humanely.
Yes,
They worked on farms.
I have a number of friends that were prisoners of war. In fact, one's right here in town. I'm sorry, he wasn't a prisoner of war, but I have others that were, and they got hungry, but the Germans were hungry at the same time, I think. They were humane. I was in the occupations force for 4 years in Germany after the war was over, and we hired German ex-fighter pilots. They were almost like an American. I mean, I grew to like them very much. And I had this 4-year assignment and got to know quite a number of Germans. I took one publisher of a newspaper up in a jet, gave him a ride, a 2-seat jet, and this was quite helpful in them understanding what is going on today. I later had a 3-year tour in Rome, Italy, and worked with the Italian Air Force for 3 years, and I was their advisor and also one of their instructors in training 6 squadrons over the period 3 years in the Starfighter. That thing cruises at a little over twice the speed of sound when you.
Is that the one on the end? We.
Anyhow, when you're making an interception, you don't go around supersonic because it leaves a boom on the ground, you know, around here. But its normal speed is a little over 1,400 miles an hour. Anyhow, along with this assignment, every 6 months we had a meeting of the different nations in Europe that were flying the 104, and one of them was German. So that's a German model there. So I got to know the chief of staff at the time of the German Air Force, and he was a fighter pilot, and he had 272 victories in World War II. Mostly Russian, they always claim. But they counted them a little bit different, I understand. If they shot down a 4-engine bomber, they got 4 credits, but that's still an enormous amount. And he was a very interesting gentleman, and I grew to like him very much. I asked him one day how he lost his left thumb. He said, well, I was flying close to Munich one day, and I had this chap of yours in a P-51, and I was just about to get him. And I forgot his wingman, and he was behind me, and just as I started to pull the trigger, all heck broke loose. He shot me down, and a caliber bullet got me right in that thumb, and I haven't seen it since. He said, I bailed out for the 6th time. He was shot down 6 times.
You know, one of the things, I did a little reading about pilots before I came to see you today. One of the things that amazes me in World War II is really we just took young men with no flying experience at all, crammed it in rapidly, put them in planes, and sent them overseas. Did I get the wrong impression?
Not at all. I can give you a good example of that. I think I was extremely fortunate in flying 1 year in the States before going overseas, because you learn a lot in a year. At least it seems that way. It used to be an old saying, kidding in a way, but halfway true, that if you lived a year or flew 500 hours after you first got your wings, you might make it. You know, that was kind of a hazardous guess.
But a lot of the pilots didn't get that year's experience.
That's right, and a lot of the pilots, without even combat, lost their life because training was kind of quick in those days. But to give you an example of what you're talking about, the time I was in Iceland, we had weather move in and out, and if the ceiling was high enough, we were flying in an old type fighter there, and we knew how to get in and get out. And they had a very obsolete radio range. That was the only thing available to get down on. And we don't have time to describe it here, but you had to know how to orientate yourself and fly in on it, and when to let down and so forth. Well, you do it often enough, you learn that. Well, there was a whole lot of times that there would be a B-17 or a B-24 bomber. They came in strings. They refueled in Greenland sometimes, and they refueled in Iceland, and then go to Scotland and so forth. These guys generally had anywhere from 250 to way under 300 hours of flying time. Now, you remember, they get over 200 hours in training just to get their wings. You're talking about 50 hours and they're in combat. Well, they would arrive in Iceland, and knowing the weather in advance, and that day, those days, was a big guess. That's all there was to it. And they couldn't get down. And so we'd go up in a fighter and fly on their wing and put the gear down to slow down enough for them to stay up. And then they would put theirs down and get behind, and we could do it all over again and say, no, no, no. And put ours down, and they'd follow us down, and we let down under the overcast. I've done that probably 8 or 10 times during just one year there. Now, those people, they had never done this before. Mm-hmm. They might have been trained in the desert in the States and never had been in the weather in their life. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they had a rough go.
It just amazes me when I read how quickly the United States mobilized resources and manpower, and
I don't know whether we ever reach those days again or not, because we didn't have any slackers in those days. If the nation got its back against the wall today, I hope they would react the same way, but they had patriotism in those days, and we have a hell of a lack of patriotism in these days. And but then they had only one attitude. They wanted to do their share.
Well, as the war ended, what did that mean for you?
Well, you've got to understand that what they have, something like 15 million people in service, I think. They had to reduce them down to maybe 1 million. I don't know what size, but I know in the Air Force, everybody expected to get out, so I had no other reason to think that. And everything you had was temporary in those days. And I had a good friend that we'd been on the same orders all through training in World War II, side by side. So we had got together what little money we had. He was a great poker player, and I had won quite a bit. And that was a different attitude in those days. If you were single, it didn't make much difference. You'd get paid the next month anyhow. And who knows, you might get shot down anyhow. So you had a different attitude. Mm-hmm. After I got married, in between assignments, I only played for nickels in the Pacific.
Changed your attitude, didn't it?
Sure. But we had done this and decided what we could borrow from this bank and that one, and we were going to put in 3 drive-in movies and go into business. And in those days, that was a red-hot item. So I was home on vacation, and the Air Force was discharging people by the thousands. And he called me and said, well, I got my orders today. I'll be out time you get back. And said, you'll probably have yours time I get back. I got back, and they offered me a regular commission in the Air Force. And I was what do you call it? They had they had AUS, temporary, you had a reserve, and a reserve I was a captain. And on active duty as a first lieutenant. But I lost the captain by accepting the first lieutenant permanent regular commission. And this is not temporary. I still have commission today. Mm-hmm. But since I wanted to fly, I decided I'll just stay in. And that's how it affected me after World War II.
So you made it your career.
Made it my career. I stayed in for 26 years, and I had some very, very interesting assignments. And there was one assignment I had lasted almost 5 years before I could get out of it. And you know, it becomes boring after a while. But I was in the Air Force's instrument instructor school, and that took regular pilots and taught them to become a specialist in instrument bad weather flying. And you got to remember, in those days, we didn't have the modern facilities we got today. And radar was kind of skimpy. Navigation was still very poor. Today, you can fly an airplane and tell any spot on Earth that you're over. You couldn't jump out and come as close as the equipment tells you. Mm. In those days, it wasn't that way. We did not know. We taught instrument flying, and there was no way to know if you had a thunderstorm out here if you couldn't see it. So you had to know how to fly through a thunderstorm. And the old slow airplanes, the procedure was slow the plane down and fly through at 6,000 feet. Well, this was in 1948. We started getting jets. I flew jets for 30 years. But they gave us 2 jets, 2-seaters, and 2 of us, myself and one other gentleman. And they wanted us to experiment with the jets, determine how to fly instruments in bad weather with a jet. And get to understand they're going much, much faster. And they're not flying down here at 6,000, they're at 40,000 feet. And not knowing when you're going to hit a thunderstorm, you got to remember you're in the clouds. And you have to be prepared. So we had some very interesting experiences in that year. I got hit by lightning 11 times during that period, going through thunderstorms. We had the leading edges beat up with hail. We were thrown from 3,000 to 5,000 feet one direction and down the other. We had a very narrow airspeed that you could fly up at that altitude, because we called it Coffin Corner.
Called it what?
Coffin Corner.
Coffin. Oh.
An airplane stalls at a certain speed. In other words, it quits flying. But you got to realize down here, that's great. At 40,000 feet, there's not any air. Very, very little air. So it will not fly. It has to have high speed to fly. Anyhow, there's a certain speed that will stall out and fall out of the air, and then there's a limit on how fast you can go, because it's not a supersonic wing. It has to be below the speed of sound. And that limit is here, and your stall speed is right under it, and you had a gap of about 20 or 30 miles per hour that you had to fly in. You couldn't get out of that gap. So the best thing you could do was tighten your seat belt, your shoulder harness, cruise through at normal speed, and just fly the attitude indicator, because you couldn't fly the entire instrument panel, because when you flew into a thunderstorm or bad weather like that, the altimeter became unreliable. It would go backwards or forwards. The airspeed would go through the red line. By then your wings should have come off. They're all false indications. And this doesn't last too long in a jet, but it's quite interesting when it does happen.
I don't think interesting's quite a strong enough word.
Well, it wasn't all that bad, but you also have to figure out a way to get down from there, you know.
So you stayed in the Air Force for 28 years?
26.
26.
I actually went to work for Governor Clement and Governor Ellington 3 months before I got out of the service, by services mutual agreement. They weren't going to let me out.
I'm right at the end of this tape, and I want to start that story of you flying for Tennessee's governors. So I'm going to pull another tape here.
Oh,
Okay, this is tape 2, and you were going to tell me some things that happened during that 26-year time.
Well, I've mentioned the 4 years after the war in Germany, and my children were quite young, and they spoke German fairly well. And I went to University of Maryland at night to try to learn German. I learned a few words. In fact, I remember a few words. I learned a lot more than that at that time. The other assignment overseas after the war was in Italy for 3 years, and that was quite an interesting assignment for me. By country agreement, we have no military forces in Rome. And I lived in Rome with my family, and we were under, there's other small amount of military personnel there, and so no military meant that I couldn't wear a uniform except on official business, certain occasions only. So I wore civilian clothes, and it's quite interesting. The only time I had a uniform on is a flying suit with the Italians. When I'd go out to the bases, I'd go out for anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to another base and fly with the Italians. And we did this until we got 1 squadron train, and we finally wound up the 6th train. And then all I did was, when I arrived, they had the ones that were having problems lined up for me to fly with. So I just become a troubleshooter after that. But the times that I was in town, I changed hats. I flew for the ambassador, Ambassador Reinhardt. And it was quite interesting because, you know, I'm a taxpayer too. So I don't guess it's hurt the taxpayers to know this, but the interesting thing about it was, he says, he had a nice plushed up twin-engine airplane, and he said, "You're not in the service as far as I'm concerned. You're flying for me. You can do anything you want to." And he said, "All I want really is a martini when the wheels come up." I said, "Great." So I flew him when I was in town, and it got to the point where I think I was one of the few people he'd fly with, and so it was quite nice. And he said, "Anytime that I'm not scheduled to use this airplane, you can take your family, go anywhere you're big enough to go." So we were able to travel some in Europe, and we were receiving an allowance for extra food and stuff in Rome because it was very expensive. In those days, a 25-cent can of beans in the States would cost 85 cents there. But that was fine. We used it when we needed it, but we would take the plane, say on a particular day, and fly to one of the military bases up north. And I would limit it. It'd hold 30 people. I'd limit it to 10 dependents. They might have a dental appointment lined up. They need to see a doctor, and they wanted to buy groceries. And we'd go to commissary and shop. Well, when you got ready to leave, those 10 people had 2 trucks back up the airplane. Each one bought between $500 and $600 worth of groceries. So that's why we had to limit it to 10 people.
You had to have room to carry your shopping.
But anyhow, well, they got their medical appointments and everything else, maybe a dentist tooth pulled or recapped. But I know one night we had weather, and over the island of Elbow we were hit by lightning, and we were hit twice that night, and these people got kind of upset.
Guess they were wondering if those groceries were worth it.
My wife said, she says, "What's Pick doing?" "He just sitting there smoking a cigar." I said, "I'm going to put my parachute on."
You told me that you went to school during all of this.
Well,
for about 25 years.
You got to understand, I didn't have any education except a high school diploma when I got in the service. And I don't think I have a lot now, maybe, but I started school when I was in March of '41, and I quit going to school when, I guess, about '66. I got out of service in '67.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is, in the States, I went to University of Alabama, I went to University of Florida, something up in Louisiana. These were night courses. College teachers would come over and teach them. And you get credits. And you got so much credit for your Air Force training because you had all kinds of physics and mathematics, especially in that type of training.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, when I went overseas, I went to University of Maryland at night. This is all a slow process. And before we went to Italy, they sent myself and my wife to Washington to a language course, 6 hours a day for 5 days a week for 6 months to learn Italian. And I was running a temperature every Friday afternoon. Too much language. But then in, I think it was '66, came back, and they sent me to the Air Force Air University at Maxwell. That has a command staff, and you know, it's the Air Force's college. And I went through that for a year, and when it all was over, they evaluated everything and said I liked about 6 months having a college degree. Well, I decided I don't think it's worth it. I said I don't have one. But the interesting thing about it, at the end of this year, at Maxwell, at this course in the Air University, that covers a lot of territory, and about 2 months, or the second class actually, after I got out, they started issuing a bachelor's degree, but I didn't get one. So I don't think it's that important. I think I got the equivalent, so I'm happy.
Oh, it sounds like to me you have quite a varied education. Tell me again, we talked about this before we turned on the tape.
What?
We talked about this before we turned on the tape, but tell me again how you came to Tennessee.
I got an assignment out of the Pentagon, and I wasn't crazy about the Pentagon, and I wasn't happy about it. I was going to go out of the service, but I had friends that decided I need to stay in, and they were able to arrange a transfer for me, and it was right down my line because I'd been an instructor and an advisor nearly my whole career, and they needed one for a new squadron forming by the Tennessee National Guard at Knoxville at McGee-Tyson. And so that was a great assignment. I had been a squadron fighter pilot commander of a squadron in Germany, and I had the particular fighter that they were getting, and I had gone through a series of problems with it, and unfortunately this made me look smarter than I was, because they took my advice and they got along great, and they became rated number 2 in the Air Force at the end of the second year. So it was quite pleasing to me. They turned out to be a terrific outfit to be with.
The Knoxville group.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I admire the Air National Guard. They're, for my money, much better than the regular Air Force, because they are, generally speaking, they're Air Force pilots that got out and are continuing flying with the Guard. You don't have any novices, but in the Air Force you've got a brand new guy that has no experience, and by the time they get some real good experience, they're getting out. So it's a much more stable affair, and their qualifications are great. And for the money, you're getting a terrific amount. But anyhow, that's how I got to Tennessee. And then I went from there, after staying an extra year, to Italy, and I came back, and I was being assigned somewhere on the West Coast, and my wife wasn't crazy about that because she wanted to raise her daughters back in this area. But anyhow, that really had no bearing at the moment. when I decided to get out of the service, I submitted my request after I'd been offered a job by Governor Clement in Ellington. I decided it was a good time to leave because at 2 more years, 28 years, my rank as a lieutenant colonel, regular, they could put you out, and they were doing it. And I could be out anywhere in the world and not have a good location to be there and not know anybody. And here I knew lots of people, and it offered a good job, and we wanted to live in Tennessee because we had become to the point where we really liked it and liked the people. Anyhow, I had worked for a bird colonel in 1946 who was now a 4-star general in charge of the Tactical Air Force on the East Coast. I submitted a resignation and for retirement, and I didn't get any answer. And meanwhile, I got the job offer from Governor Clement for Governor Ellington. I said, well, and Governor Ellington called and said, you going to work for me? And I said, well, I'd like to, but it doesn't look like I can get out of the service. And he said, well, I'll have you out before tomorrow afternoon. I said, how are you going to do that? I'm going to call Lyndon. Well, Lyndon Johnson was president, and he seldom called him Lyndon, he called him Buddy. He had worked for him in between times being governor of Tennessee. And he was currently the president. And I said, well, why don't you let me make another phone call before you do that? So I called this general's office again, and the aide said, well, hang on a minute. And the general got on and says, Pickron, and he called me an unnatural name, of course. He says, go ahead and go to work for that governor. He says, I'll get you out of the damned Air Force when I can. So it was 3 months later I got out of the service. But that's how I wound up with a job as flying the governor of Tennessee, and it lasted till I quit. I just got tired, and I figured it's time to hang up my wings after 38 years.
Do you miss flying?
I didn't for a long time. Every time one goes over, though, I'll look up. And sometimes I would like to go back and try it some more, but I don't think I'll be able to do that.
Well, tell me.
Since then, I've had a nice ride in a glider plane, done some other things, but I've enjoyed retirement greatly, and I really haven't missed flying, but you never get completely away from it. It's just part of you.
Will you tell me before we started that you took your granddaughter up in a plane when she was 10 years old, and
Yes.
she said she wanted to become a pilot, and you said she has become a pilot?
Yes, she went through my son and went. I have 3 kids that graduated from MTSU, and my son went through the aerospace course, and for the last 23 years he's been the FedEx Express, and he's, I guess for 15 or 16 years, been the director of Flight Operations Support Department, which is a pretty good sized place in Memphis. Anyhow, I took my granddaughter up when she was 10 years old in a Learjet, and she promptly announced she was going to be a pilot. And so she went through MTSU college. Incidentally, we wore out a washing machine for all the kids and grandkids going to MTSU. But she instructed for a number of years, and finally got on with Continental, and just 2 weeks ago they made her a captain. So she's flying the smaller airplanes, but she's flying a jet that seats 100 people. So that's not too small.
No, it's not.
And to be a captain in this short period of time is amazing.
Well, let's go back to your flying for the governor. I told you we have the Ellington collection at the Gore Center. Tell me about flying for Governor Ellington.
Well, I wound up flying for 3 full-time governors, and the tail end of one and the beginning of another.
Okay.
But
so you flew for Frank Clement first.
I only flew for a few months for him, and then 4 years for Governor Ellington, and 4 years with Governor Dunn, and 4 years with Governor Blanton, and 4 months with Governor Alexander. In fact, 4 months before, just as Governor Alexander became governor, I retired, quit. but unfortunately they were going to sell a Learjet. Of course, that's a side story that I think was a mistake, but that's just my opinion. But they had to have a pilot fly it till it was sold, and they didn't pay too much attention to my recommendation against the guy that they hired, and I came back from a 6 weeks fishing trip after I quit, and it was sitting on the ground, and I said, "Where's that pilot you hired?" "Well, we fired him at the end of 1 week." So they hired me to come back and fly it for almost 4 more months. Says, "We'll pay you just like a painter. Walk in the door. Tell us what you want to charge." And so I gave them a figure, and so much for flying hour and so forth, and I flew it till they sold it. But I'd already retired and got away from it. I hadn't planned on staying any longer.
Yeah. Well, tell me about the Ellingtons.
Governor Ellington, I think, is one of the greatest gentlemen I ever met. That includes his family. It's hard to know where to begin, except that I think he was a real professional governor, and it turned out he was a real friend. And
You tell me there's a compassionate side of Governor Ellington that a lot of people did not know.
well, I know he treated my wife and my family just like we remember his family, which, of course, that may not be compassion, but it shows what a man he is. But there was numerous occasions, and under him and other governors, that there would be Tennesseans, indigenous type Tennesseans, that might say they'd reached the end of the rope financially and they couldn't afford an emergency. And I know that one occasion I picked up a lady, I think it was in Massachusetts, one I'm not sure, somewhere up there. She had a broken back, couldn't get home, and I brought her back. I've flown paralyzed boys to San Antonio for treatment numerous times for one family, and I flew a number of children to Burn Hospital in Galveston, Texas, that was treated by the Shriners at no cost. There were other occasions when they happened. It'd be in the middle of the night usually. I made several flights. One, for example, to pick up a kidney in Chicago, and bring it back for someone to be operated on here.
For transplant.
Mm-hmm. One occasion, at a later date, all the airports were closed on the East Coast, and there was a kidney. The guy transporting the kidney was stuck in Boston. The airlines weren't flying, and the place was snowed in, and visibility is right down on the ground. And I had been flying all day, and I got a call from the governor. It says, "It's a matter of life and death. Can you get in there?" And I said, "Well, all I can do is try, but everybody's grounded, and the airport's closed." He said, "Well, the guy's going to die. If you think you can make it, give it a try." So I found out that by just barely stretching things, I could have an alternate airport in case I couldn't get in Pennsylvania. And you might be on fumes, but I thought I could make it. So anyhow, this is a side note that might be interesting. My son, they always kid about, a pilot. Anybody can be a pilot. And, so I said, this was about 10:30, the phone rang, and they wanted me to go to Boston. When I decided to go, I said, "Okay, come on, you're going on the jump seat." Well, that kind of upset the wife, but anyhow, I took him with me, and on a flight like that, on your clearance, you file lifeguard so and so. And what this does is it clears the path. Everybody moves aside and gives you the right of way over everything. And even applies to much more than that. So we took off, and immediately the control center said, "Boston advised you that the airport's closed." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" "Well, it's got a foot or a foot and a half of snow on the runway." I said, "Well, get some rotary graders out and clear it." And a little while later they said, "Well, we're going to put 6 road graders on it, and how much runway do you need?" And I gave them the length, and the last road grader pulled off as I started the approach. And we made the approach with the modern facilities we have nowadays, and it's wonderful. And I happen to have done this many times in the training that we had in the Air Force in the 5 years that I taught about weather flying. And the first time my son saw the ground was as the gears touched the wheels touched the ground. Just a minute.
Hold the tape. Your grandson stopped by, and so we've stopped the tape.
Okay.
We've started again. But you're showing me models of planes.
Right. I flew some.
Now this one is, what'd you say this one is?
I was going to say I flew some 50-some odd planes in 26 years, but these are some of the ones I flew most. And this is the old P-40, the obsolete plane started out World War II with, that Flying Tigers were used in China. And when they absorbed the Air Force, 14th Air Force, they brought some of these back, and I flew some of these same planes out in Arizona during the first year I was out there. It was a very good airplane. It was just, you know, it wasn't in the class of the later fighters. It was slower.
It would be heavier, it looks like.
This one was a P-47D model, and I flew this over in the European area. And in those days you had brand new planes and had your name on it and the crew chief's name, all that kind of stuff, and you usually had a nickname. Well, I wasn't married then, but I was raised next door to Bess, my current wife. My only wife. And so I put B-E-S-S, just Bess, on the side of this new airplane. Well, in those days, you didn't have an engine you could get in and race right now. You had to call what they call slow time. In other words, you had to break them in slower. In other words, at a smaller setting and then increasing the power later. In the first 10 hours, it was at reduced power settings. So I was up flying this plane, on a brand new plane, on a test top, and putting time on it so that we could build up at 10 hours. And I got a call from our radar controller and said, "We have a boogie, which is an unknown airplane. So-and-so, can you investigate?" I said, "Yeah." And I was down at low altitude, and he was up around 30,000 feet. And anyhow, they kept increasing and said, "Go Buster. Go Buster is wide open." Well, that's hard on the engine. But I did, and it turned out to be a German twin-engine Ju-88. And, you know, I was excitable then. Man, this is my chance. I'm really somebody's going to pat me on the back after today, you know. But just as I got almost close enough to fire the guns, that plane, all smoke came out of the engines, and I couldn't see outside the cockpit. It just caught on fire. Well, I was over the water, and not too far out, but your time on the water without air-sea rescue, which we had none, was estimated to be 5 minutes before you lost consciousness. It was that cold. So I had to get back over the land. I couldn't bail out. We didn't have bailout bottles either, so there wasn't any oxygen up there, and you wouldn't make it down to low altitude before you passed out. So I rolled it bottom side up, went straight down, and hit compressibility. That's where it goes so fast that it won't go supersonic with the wings it has, but it hits the point where so much airflow that the controls are useless. They're frozen in place. And the only way you come out is when you get down lower in solid air, and you come out with just the trim tab. And if you come out too steep, you black out, you lose consciousness again. So I was trying to blow the fire out and get over the land at the same time. Fortunately, I was able to get to the airport and land with the engine cut off. And anyhow, they put out whatever the fire was, and they put me a new engine in. And the next time I flew it, the crew chief had put Fireball Bessie instead of just Bess. So that was the way it got its name. And later on, I had a squadron of these 86s. This is a type that you use in Korea. This is our bulldog insignia for the squadron. And once again, you had individual airplanes and had your names on them and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I had a squadron of these, and this is what I came back and advised on the Tennessee Air Guard in the same minute. This one had radar. The ones in Korea didn't. But this is an all-weather interceptor, and it had an afterburner, and it fired 24 rockets on the pod that dropped down. And it wasn't supersonic, but it was quite fast, and it had swept-back wings. And the last 4 or 5 years I flew was this F-104. It's 56 feet long, and it has 7-foot 7-inch wing on each side.
A what?
7 feet 7 inches is the length of the wing on each side. 21 feet from tip to tip. And its intercept cruise speed is twice the speed of sound, just a little bit more so, actually. And so that makes things happen right rapidly. In fact, one day I went from Nashville to Knoxville in 6 minutes. It took another 7 minutes to slow down and land. But that's how fast it is.
Oh my goodness.
Well, it was great. At the initial climb rate, you're just kind of sitting on your back going up like that. And it was a thrill to fly. It took a little experience because with everything working to slow it down for a landing, it still came in at about 190 miles an hour for touchdown. That's its slow speed. If it wasn't everything working, it'd come in around 250 and 60 mile an hour for the touchdown.
Oh my goodness.
And it had a drag chute, which helped when you slowed down enough to use it. So it was a pretty high performance airplane. In fact, all these airplanes are high performance for their day.
My goodness. Well, we were talking. Go ahead.
The next one in fact, I flew several under Governor Ellington, but this was the one that he flew in mostly. And
a Beechcraft.
We had an old airplane called the Aero Commander, prop plane, and it had been around quite a while, and he thought it was getting too old, and he wasn't comfortable in it. In fact, it was getting rather old. I thought it was all right, but still, he talked him into buying this new turboprop. These are jet engines turned into propellers, and it's called the King Air, and it's a beautiful little airplane. Cruise faster than the other one by far. Pressurized, you can get to higher altitude, you can get above a lot of the weather, and it has radar capability so you can see the storms and all that. Anyhow, we flew this, and we had several other planes and quite a number of pilots, and we had their own hangar. I was in charge of the pilots, the hangar, and the maintenance. And later, Governor Dunn bought this airplane, or under his administration, and it's a Learjet, and that's a Minotaur 104. This has much higher weight, higher performance, and it cruises like the airliner speeds at 41,000 feet, up to 49,000. So it was a great improvement, and it was used for him on trips, and the biggest usage was to fly industrialists in here. And I've flown many people that wound up putting in factories in this state, so it paid for itself many times over. For example, the King Air, a turboprop, to go to Toronto or New York would take, well, say New York, it would take about between 9 and 10 hours to go up there and back in the King Air. So you'd have to pick the gentleman up, a CEO of a company, bring him down, he'd spend the night, next day, and either go home late that night or the third day. With the Learjet, you could fly up early in the morning, leave there at 8 o'clock, show him his area in Tennessee, and have him home by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now,
My
this made a
goodness.
lot of difference to people that we were picking up.
They were impressed.
Impressed. And it's much more convenient. A very interesting thing about this Learjet is the call sign. All North American planes, civilian planes, start with the letter N. After that, you have certain letters and numbers. And picking this up at the factory, the state got a wonderful buy, incidentally. They took a plane and ran it back through the assembly line, a used plane, and put it out like a new one. I mean, it completely overhauled and completely like a new airplane, and sold it to us as a used airplane, which was a wonderful buy. In fact, 4.5 or 5 years later, the state made about $150,000 on it after using it all these years. But anyhow, back to the call sign. Very interesting, I think. I called back and I said, "What do you want on the tail?" And the governor's wife said,
Telling me about the call sign
"Okay,
and that you couldn't put Tennessee on it.
too many words and letters." But he said, "That's not what I mean. Put 10EC. She said, "Well, you said you couldn't do it." No, he said, "Put 10 Echo Charlie. That's 10EC. So the call sign was known as Tennessee. Hello, Learjet, Tennessee. All over the eastern
Tennessee.
coast, the controllers, they didn't call it by the number. They said, "How you doing, Tennessee?" And they'd call you by that name, which has made it quite interesting.
It's like our license plates today. Sometimes I feel like I'm going to run
Right.
into someone trying to figure out what they're trying to say on their
Right.
license plate.
That's correct.
We were talking about, that I don't enjoy flying. And you were telling me that there's an interesting story about Governor Ellington. His daughter led me to believe that he did not enjoy flying.
Well, I think that was true. And I think that I'm the only one he flew with in the 4 years, maybe once or twice somebody else
That's
when I
what she
wasn't
told
here.
me.
But what's interesting about it is this. We bought this new airplane. It had all the modern facilities for navigation. It had weather radar, and you could even see the cities on the ground with it at night. And yet he wanted to avoid all weather. Well, that's impossible. You know, if you've got a front between here and wherever you happen to be and you come back, the plane will only go so high. It's not a pure jet. And it was impossible to get completely over all weather. So we tried this several times and it didn't work out. I know he was tense. And finally I said, "How about getting up front here?" He got up there and I said, "Look, we can't go any higher, and this thing doesn't perform at this altitude well. We're going to go back down right through the middle of it." We're not either. As we are, I said, "You know, I'm supposedly an expert on weather flying. I've taught this for many, many years." I said, "I want to show you what this plane's capability is." So I had the radar on, and there was a thunderstorm about 20 miles over here to our left, and another one about 20 miles to the right. I said, "Look, this tells us that we can go straight through the middle and probably won't even receive a bump. If we do, it won't be dangerous." So we did, and it turned out beautiful. And I said, "You know, this equipment here tells you exactly where you are." I said, "We're exactly 7.5 miles southeast of Montgomery, Alabama." "How do you know that?" "Well, this equipment tells us this." And we finally got out of the clouds, and I said, "We're in this position, that." Finally, he decided to believe me. And after that flight, he didn't object to me determining the best altitude. And he started relaxing, in my opinion. I don't think he ever felt as comfortable on a plane as he would in a car. Personally, I think they're dangerous, the cars, I mean. But he seemed to relax after that, and he flew much, much, much more. And I think I had his confidence, and it was quite interesting the change that came over him. And he might never admitted it, but I know darn well he relaxed after that. And it's a lack of not knowing, you know, not knowing what is going on.
Yeah, that's what you said the fear of flying is.
That's what fear of flying is. Once you explain everything, once they understand it. I had a guest aboard one time, and she was born in Montgomery. We're back to that same city for some reason. And we were flying at night, and the weather was clear, and had her up front, and I was showing her all these things, you know, and she had a fear of flying. Her husband said she hates it on a plane worse than anything in the world. Okay, she just won't fly hardly ever. But they were invited with the governor on this trip. So I pointed out where we were in Montgomery. She said, well, that's where I was born and raised, you know. Going along, pointed out other towns and so forth. And she said, well, we're about to land. I said, that's right. I better get out. No, you sit right there. So we went in for the final approach, and I said, you know, there's very little to this. I'm just easing back on the control. You can do the same thing. And we touched down real smooth and taxied in, and he called me the next day, said she was highly impressed, said she would fly anywhere now on an airplane.
I just needed to fly with you, didn't I?
Well, there's that 1 out of 100 that you can't convince. And they might have been scared out of their wits at one time, and I wouldn't blame them, but that's the way flying is.
I don't want to leave without asking you about the Fighter Pilot Association. We do that, we'll finish with Governor Ellington.
Okay. Well, there's a few things that might be interesting, a sideline, and I don't know whether he would like if I told you all these things or not, but he was quite a kidder. Mm. And he didn't do this with his staff. In fact, he would find a reason in a joking way to fire myself or his aide nearly every flight we made and spent the night somewhere. And
to fire you?
Fire us. You're going to be fired. I just can't go to help anymore, so I'm going to fire you after you get me home, of course. He always added that. But so we had a little private joke going for many years, a long time, even after he became governor. And one day we had flown down to Florida, and he'd like to get away, and he was a golfer. And he had carried I think the commissioner was, I believe he was finance commissioner, I believe who he was. Anyhow, we landed, and he got out, and his car was there waiting on him, and got out and stretched, said, well, boys, said, he's talking to us, said, we're going to leave about Sunday at 2 o'clock. I said, yes, sir, Governor. Said, if you're not here, do you want us to wait? I'm going to fire you. I can't go to help anywhere. And he got in the car and slammed the door, and away they went. And this finance commissioner says, Pick, was he kidding? I said, yeah. He said, that's the first time I've ever heard him kid, and I've known him for 17 years. So this went on all the time. Mm-hmm. He had a great sense of humor, and he would call me at home on the weekends, and I never followed baseball in my life, but he said, now they're in the final playoffs. I'll give you a choice of the team, and you're still going to lose. I'll bet you $1. So this went on many times. And he was a great winner and a poor loser. He put on a great show when he lost. You'd have to corner him in order to get your money out of him. And he'd slam it on the table and walk out. But this is all a show. He enjoyed that, and he was so nice to my family, and his family was the same. I've known him all these years and still in pretty close contact. And in fact, last year I was one of Mrs. Ellington's pallbearers, and I thought that was quite an honor. Stop. I was going to say, he was a very nice man to know. I think when you became his friend, he called you buddy. I've heard him pick up the phone and call President Johnson, "Hello, buddy." You know, I thought that was quite unusual. But in fact, I was fortunate enough to go one weekend to President Johnson's ranch in Texas with him, and they in turn treated us the same way he did. In fact, the president parked our airplane. I had to make a side flight and come back, and there he was, and he helped me refuel the airplane. I thought that was quite unusual. He was real familiar with it. We're talking about the president now.
Lyndon Johnson?
He and his wife had I guess they owned the King Air. I think they owned TV stations and something, I don't know what else. But so he was quite familiar with the King Air, and he asked me all kinds of questions about it. I was quite amazed. But I got to meet many, many interesting people. I flew many country entertainers, and they performed free. I got to know Minnie Pearl extremely well, I thought, her husband, Henry Cannon, and Roy, what's his name?
Acuff?
Roy Acuff. He flew co-pilot New York with me one time. And my wife and I picked up Bob Hope on a trip, and I flew the Secretary of UN and United Nations and his family. A number of other governors and Secretary of Agriculture and different people like that. Different occasions. It was just it was an education to me.
We talked earlier, we were talking about while your grandson was here. You've enjoyed every day of your career, it sounds like.
Yeah, I've enjoyed every day since then, too, since I retired.
But you really enjoyed what you did.
Absolutely. I certainly did. Didn't make much money. I was offered a fabulous job with National Airways in 1947, I think it was, or 49. They were expanding greatly, and they came to this all-weather outfit I was in, and they didn't have choice of too many pilots that had the kind of experience, and so they offered us a fabulous offer. I couldn't see flying from point A to point B then. I wanted to be a fighter pilot and be able to go bottom side up anytime I wanted to. I would have made a lot more money in my career if I'd have gone with them, I think, but I enjoyed life like it was, very much.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
Since I retired, we take maybe a major trip and some sidelines during a year, and we've been a lot of places. We've been to New Zealand and Australia and Alaska a couple of times, Hawaii several times, Germany and England and Guatemala and Italy and Greece and Turkey, and I hope to go to Spain. I've been there, the wife hadn't, except for overnight visit, and maybe this coming September. But I like to travel.
Yes, I can tell you do. I have just a little bit of tape left, and
Okay.
I wondered if you could tell me about the Fighter Pilot Association.
Well, that's the Middle Tennessee Fighter Pilot Association, and it started about 10 years ago, I believe, and a couple of the guys got together that and decided what they could find around locally, and they set up the rules. You had to have flown a fighter, not anything else, but a fighter in actual combat in World War II. We have no dues. Whoever sits up front is the leader. No president, no officers, no dues. And we tell each other stories. Some say biggest liar wins, but really they're based on the truth. And it's quite interesting to sit around the table and listen. We've had governors, senators, test pilot from England, one from California that put the test flights on the Blackbird, the SR-71, which is Mach 3 or more, the fastest plane in the world. We've had 3 different shuttle pilots. Once in a while we get good speakers like that, and that makes for interesting. And the wives, we have a picnic in the summer and a Christmas party, and the wives are invited. In fact, anytime we have a good speaker that we ever invited. So we've only got about 30 members. And anyhow, we decided one day that we wondered, our grandkids think we're lying anyhow, I think. So we thought maybe the great-grandkids might be interested in some of the things we'd done. So we sat down and wrote a story piece, and we put it in a paperback book and paid for it ourselves. And we gave this to the grandkids and great-grandkids and the brother-in-laws and the brothers and the sisters and also. Anyhow, it was a total loss, but we had a record. And somehow, let's see, who are they there? Lost my memory. Who published our book?
Well, I saw it at Limeball. I checked it out at the local library.
Anyhow,
and it was in paperback.
McGraw-Hill.
Yeah. Then there's a hardback version of it.
The McGraw-Hill aviation editor got a hold of that copy, and I don't know who sent it to him. But he sent us a contract and says, write us a book. So we put out a 328-page book. There's 30 co-authors. That's quite a book, isn't it? I mean, quite authors. Each guy wrote a couple of stories about, had to do with World War II. And we have members that are in the old Army Air Corps, now Air Force. We have Navy pilots, and we have Marine. And we all have this in common. And, you know, you feel like brothers because you all, you've done the same thing. And
it's an experience that a lot of us today can understand.
Maybe so.
It's an experience that changed your lives.
Yes. We meet the last Friday of each month at Vanderbilt University Club for lunch, and that's it. And fortunately, we've made a little money on the book, so we don't have to have any dues now. And we've contributed some to MTSU aerospace program, and right now I think they're about to get rid of most of the rest of it, but we keep enough to give a free book to speakers and stuff like that. So I don't know how much longer this outfit will last, but we're losing members every year. They're getting old.
It's wonderful that those stories have been recorded.
Well, I'm sure there's more fantastic books, and you got to remember that we're just one out of thousands, and most of the other thousands had even as much or more exciting things or experiences than we did. So it's just...
this group is just Middle Tennessee?
Yes, just from Middle Tennessee. And we have members from Tullahoma, and we have Dixon, and over towards Crossville, and just the Middle Tennessee area, mostly out of Nashville. We got 4 from Murfreesboro. We have 3 Air Force and 1 Navy from Murfreesboro. Or 4 Air Force, I think. And some of the other guys have had some really interesting experiences, like bailing out over Czechoslovakia, walking out, never became a prisoner. Took them 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think I read that. Was that Mr. Ridley?
Yes.
Story?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I read that. They're just
You
they're
have to be extremely good or lucky to do that.
Now, I think your story involved bringing beer back, didn't it?
Yes.
Was that your story?
Yeah, that's one of them.
Came back without your ammunition, but a load of beer
Well,
for the mechanics.
We lost quite. You got to think about this. We went down low, and every target we hit, we had. I wouldn't be able to count them, but you might have 1,000 guns shooting at you. So we lost some planes, and so this little trip was down to Guam to pick up 8 new fighters, and I took the flight down and picked them up, and I didn't drink beer, didn't drink anything, but we had people that worked all night on the planes and the flight line. So we thought the bomber pilots lived a little better than we did. In fact, we know they did. So we liberated some beer from them and took the ammo out and put the beer in the wings of the airplane and brought it back, and and gave it to flight land crew, and they were quite thankful.
I'm sure they were.
And you got to remember, they're sitting out there in 110 degrees every day.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I've really enjoyed reading it and made
Good.
some
Well,
copies.
Glad you did.
And I want to thank you for letting me come today.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and
I've enjoyed this so much.
all these characters like me like to talk.
Well, I'm gonna be contacting some of them, and I appreciate
Well, you're quite welcome.
the interview today. Okay.
I've got to get them sorted here in order.
Okay, today is September 18th, and I'm visiting with Bill Pickron, and we're looking through some of his pictures that are memorabilia to go along with his interview.
Well, let me get these in order just a minute. That's on the book.
Yeah.
Anyhow, this is pictures over in Europe, first time. That's doing my laundry. I smoke cigars in it. That's our flight surgeon. This is what I called my wife then.
You called her what?
Twerp.
Twerp.
That's before we got married. Anyhow,
Well, not, let's see. Let me have that if I'm going to scan some of those. Now, is this you?
no, that's me,
Okay.
and this is the flight surgeon,
Oh, okay.
Doc Pratt. Anyhow, this was their same area, same time, and you're looking at Fireball Bessie there.
Yeah, now tell me that story again because we
Well-
don't have it on our tape.
Real briefly, this was a brand new airplane we received in 1943, I guess.
What is this plane?
It's a P-47,
Okay.
the old Republic fighter, which was new then. Anyhow, that's a picture of me sitting on the ramp, either before or after a mission, one or the other.
Bill, you look so young
I
in this
was.
picture. How old are you there?
There,
Yeah. I bet you're
just
not.
barely 20 years old.
I was going to say, you don't even look 20.
I got my wings when I was 19.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I wasn't married then, and my girlfriend I was raised next door to was named Bess, B-E-S-S. We had never dated. We were friends, had been all our life. But with that name of Bess on there, one day when it was brand new, it had a brand new engine, and in those days, that engine and the automobile engines had to be slow time. You had to treat them nice and not have them run them wide open initially. You know, having so many miles on a car before you could open it up. And I was the only one up in the air over the base flying this thing on a test stop. And they called and said, "We have an unknown, would like you to investigate."
Now, where were you?
This was over in Iceland
Iceland.
at
Okay.
the time. I later got over to London area, but anyhow, they wanted me to go in a hurry, so I just opened it wide open and let it go. I got to 32,000 feet and was closing in on this plane, and the engine caught fire. And so I pointed it straight down to the ground and hoped it'd blow the flames out, but it didn't. So when I finally leveled off at an enormous high speed, I cut the engine off and made it to an airstrip and put it on the ground. And 2 days later, they brought it back out, repaired, and the crew chief had changed from Bess to Fireball Bessie. That's how that got the name.
I want to take that and scan it and include it in the
Okay.
interview. Okay.
And
What else do you
I
have
went
here?
back, after that I went to the Pacific in a plane that looked similar, but it was a much longer range plane. It had supposedly 2,500 mile range for a single engine fighter.
What is this plane called?
Called the P-47, just like
Oh,
the other,
oh,
but
okay.
it's the N model. It was a later model.
Oh.
And we picked it up in Hawaii and flew it to Okinawa across the Pacific, the whole group. We landed in Johnson Island. We operated out of the Majura Islands for a while. And then we flew on to Eniwetok, refueled, and went to Guam, refueled, and landed in Okinawa after that.
So you went from Iceland to the Pacific.
Yes.
Wow, what a change.
And in the Pacific, we were on a little island. It was very small. It was a mile wide and a mile and a half long.
Is that a picture of the island?
Yeah, it only had, got a picture somewhere of what it looked like originally. But anyhow, it was a Japanese field, and it was very small. And the runways were short. There it is right here.
It looks like the whole island is just runways.
Well, no, that's their airfield. These are little short runways.
Uh-huh.
And when we got there, they had opened up one runway that we landed on. And that's what I showed you a minute ago, wherever it is. Anyhow.
What was the name of this island?
This is the, let's see, the date was in the last month of the war. When the Japanese were talking about surrendering, they had to go to see MacArthur in the Philippines. And we were in between there.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is they had to fly into our little island. We were escorted in and two of their planes and transferred to MacArthur's airplane and flown down to the Philippines.
So the Japanese came into your island.
Yeah, this little bitty island.
Left their plane.
Left their aircraft and their crew and
this island?
that island right there.
What's the name of that island? Do you remember? Oh, is that it?
Ieshima.
Okay.
Capital I, capital E, Shima. Shima means island in Japanese.
Uh-huh.
Ieshima.
Huh.
And it was about up off the northern end of Okinawa, the main island. Anyhow, Japanese flew in and flew out, came back through, and of course the war is over a few days later, and I flew. My last mission was the day the war was over, the 14th of, when was it? What was that month?
August.
August.
Isn't that correct?
Okay, August the 14th.
Hold on just a minute. You flew the last day of the war?
Yes.
Why?
I just got, I think it was one of the last missions that was ever made, except I learned the other day it wasn't. I was in the bookstore the other day, and I bought a book, which I haven't got to read yet. And it was a B-29 that had a midnight mission that night from Guam.
On the last day of the war?
Right. So they claimed to be the last ones that flew.
What was your mission that last day? Do you remember?
As I recall, it was one like we had numerous times. It was hitting oil refinery and storage tanks, knocking out their fuel.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were very short of fuel, and we kept burning their refineries up.
Did you know at that point in time that the war was almost over?
I had a good suspicion it was, because the Japanese surrender team had gone down to do that, and they'd come back and had left for Japan, so I assumed it wouldn't be long.
Yeah.
Anyhow, here's a picture that shows Manila before World War II and after World War II. I got down there after the war, visited. This was MacArthur's headquarters. One of the few buildings wasn't leveled.
Oh my goodness.
So,
is that from bombing?
Yes, and ground artillery, whatever they used. And there's another picture before and after. So, pretty interesting picture.
Goodness. Yes.
And over on Okinawa, this is a picture of some of the natives, how they live and so forth. And
now, the natives there, did this affect them every day, or were they too remote to?
I'm sure they were affected heavily during the taking of Okinawa, but what happened is they all migrated up to the north end.
Mm-hmm.
Our forces never took over that area, just bypassed it and left them up there. So these pictures are where they were living up on the northern end of the island.
Yeah, because they all look pleasant. And
Pardon?
They all look pleasant and
yes, they
happy.
do.
I mean,
I don't. I didn't see too many of them. This was a few days after the war.
Uh-huh.
Maybe they were glad it was over too. Another picture of a little island. I had one little hill.
It's just one. Good.
This is Nagasaki. This is a target map that we use to hitting targets in Japan, and we had 3 missions on this ordnance plant, a railway depot somewhere in here, on a sulfur mine. This was entering to Nagasaki, and I'd been on a mission far inland, about 1,000 miles from our place, and they had briefed us not to get within 50 miles of Nagasaki. Well, when you go 1,000 miles and fly local and come back, you're sweating fuel. You hope you got enough to get home, and there's all kinds of water between you and home. So I was coming through there, and instead of going around, your attitude was, sorry, they don't want me over Nagasaki, too bad. I want to get home.
Mm-hmm.
So I went right over it, and I got about 15 miles beyond it, and the atomic bomb went off. So at first I just looked back here, and there's just a small smoke coming up. I was at 30,000 feet, and pretty soon it was higher than I was. So I turned around, cut the guns off, and left the gun camera on and took pictures. At that distance, all it showed was a small spiral of smoke. And I'd turn the gun cameras in every mission, and they kept mine. Never did send it back to me. I saw it years later. But that was one of our maps for Nagasaki. We also had other maps, but this is a...
Now, did you fly from this map? Would this be the map that you would use?
This was used in briefing, and we also carried it because it's small enough and didn't take up the whole cockpit.
Uh-huh.
But we had other things to show us. We hit the end of the island, we went up here and found a harbor, and, you know, it's a helpful thing. I just thought it'd be worth keeping.
Did you,
That's the next, I think the day after or 2 days later, I flew back through, and that's Nagasaki. But
did you know what the atomic bomb was?
no, at that time we hadn't heard of the first one.
What were you thinking when you saw the smoke?
I was thinking that I'd heard of, we carried 2,000-pound bombs, one on each wing.
Mm-hmm.
And I had heard that they'd built some 4,000-pound bombs for bombers, and I figured that must be one of them. But, you know, at 15 miles, it's just a huge column coming up.
Uh-huh.
And I'd never seen one before, but wasn't concerned. I was coming on home, and pretty soon it was up 2 miles high, 3 miles high, past where I was, and kept going. So I figured that can't be just 4,000-pounder.
Oh.
So I turned around and took pictures later. The next day we heard about the other one, and that they was dropping another one here.
So you knew what,
I
the
knew
next
what it
day
was
you
then,
knew what you had seen
but
the day
I
before.
already released the gun film.
Oh.
And on this island, anyhow, that is the edge of the runway, the one we first landed on. And Ernie Powell was a very famous reporter in World War II, and he was shot and killed on this little side of this runway, and they buried him right next door to it. That was the entrance. Those people were lost on one little island.
Oh, that's a cemetery?
Mm-hmm. Here's where he was buried. That's a monument to him, where he was killed. That's a flight. That's the way we flew normally. Flight of 4, but I had a flight of 8. You had 2 groups like this. And that's flight of 8. I had a buddy that had a flight of 8, and the 2 of us usually went on a mission together, 16 into Japan, 16 out. That's the way we flew. We didn't fly in huge formations. That's me.
Mm-mm. Are you by the monument there?
I think I took that picture.
Okay.
This is Bobby Cox. Wait a minute. I don't know. That looks like me, but I don't know.
I thought it might be.
I don't know whether it is or not. No, I really don't know. That's Japanese landing at that little island. And
That must have been something.
we had people with guns for a mile on each side.
That must have been something to see
It
Japanese
was very
planes
interesting
coming
because,
in.
you know,
To
now these
land.
you may don't want to see, but at the end of the war, I went around and took some pictures. All these planes were on groups on this island, 350 of them on that one little island. It was really crowded.
350 planes?
Planes, yeah.
On that little island?
Fighters and B-25s. That's what I took my mother up in, one of these.
Mm-hmm.
B-17 bombers, RC Rescue, P-51s. Some of the paint jobs. P-38s. There's P-51.
There were some very
There's a
artistic
Navy
people.
Navy Corsair here. They weren't based there, but that's a picture of one. We used to fight with them for fun.
The Corsair?
Yeah, they were based on Okinawa, and we'd come back off a mission together. Sometimes we'd go around in circles for a while at each other, just for fun.
You had some very artistic people painting on these
Yes, sir.
airplanes.
This is a plane I flew out here. Not this one, but anyhow, they had all kinds of pictures.
Well, you know, that's what you recognize from old war movies and stuff.
Right.
The pictures, the girls' pictures painted on the
Right.
planes.
Uh-huh. And Bobby Cox, he's dead now. This is my buddy from Texas that we flew together. We were on the flying orders where we got our wings, and every assignment thereafter till the war was over. He just lived 90 miles from where I was raised.
Your paths crossed a lot then.
Yes, we stayed together the entire World War II.
Wow.
And he had the other flight of 8, and I had my flight of 8.
Wow.
This is me.
Now, are these pictures going to be part of this, what was it, Tennessee Aviation
No,
Hall of Fame?
I only took them up to show them to them. They can,
Oh, okay.
They can pick a few out if they want it
Mm-hmm.
and enlarge them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to Italy, and that was the group commander of the Italians. We wore 2 hats. We worked for the ambassador when I was in town, and the Italians when I was out of town. And every time the ambassador had a party and a big dance, we generally were invited, and especially when someone was from our home state. And I was registered as Texas. That's where I was raised.
Mm-hmm.
So Governor Connolly's wife came over. He was a governor, and my Bess and I had to escort her and to the dance that night, and I have to meet him and give him money and counterpart funds. They can't spend them outside of Italy. Our government can't.
Hmm.
And so I wore 2 hats, and I flew the ambassador for 3 years while I was there. And that's up one of the bases. That's me. And later on, this is a picture of some of my friends. Now, this is a commander in Washington of the Air Guard. I was an advisor to the Guard up at Knoxville for a number of years. And this is a guy who replaced me. He and I were stationed together in Germany in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably at the time the world's most famous test pilot, in my opinion.
The most famous what?
Test pilot.
Test pilot.
He
Okay.
worked for Lockheed. He put the test on that plane right there, and a whole bunch of others, and first flights, you know.
Uh-huh.
And we had received that 104, the high-speed job, built by Lockheed, and he came representing Lockheed. I hadn't met him years before.
Who is he?
Tony LaVere, he's dead now. But
Tony LaVere.
he was a good friend. And this is Gordon Cooper, of course.
Now, we were talking about
Wimpy
him earlier.
Wilson,
He's
yeah.
he's one of the first astronauts.
Right. Wimpy Wilson was the general in charge of the Guard in Washington, D.C. It was a 4-year time, I guess. But the astronauts had an announcer, that public announcer that covered them everywhere they went. This is Shorty Powers right here. And I have other pictures of other guys I used to be stationed with. And quite often they would all come in to McGee Tyson and spend the night at our house. We've had them sleeping on bags on the floor and everywhere. Cook steaks and enjoy it. And I'm going to a reunion, and he probably will be there next week in San Antonio.
Now that's
Cooper?
Gordon Cooper again.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I showed you a picture of checking him out in the airplane. We just got down from the flight on that.
Now, what were you doing?
Well, he wasn't getting enough flying time, and he'd never flown this airplane anything that fast.
Uh-huh.
And so he would come to Knoxville and spend the weekend with me, and I'd get him flying time in this airplane. He wasn't flying. He loved to fly, just like I did. And in Germany, he flew 40 or 50 hours a month, nearly every day.
Mm-hmm.
And NASA when they were astronauts, they're only giving them 4 hours a month. Well, that kind of upset him. So he'd slip off on the weekends and we'd fly this thing.
Did he volunteer for the astronaut program?
Oh, heck yes, they all did.
Really?
Mm.
Were you ever interested in it?
I was too old. I don't think they'd ever take me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
Because,
this,
I mean, I
this
don't
was
even think about it
58,
now, but
58,
that astronaut program
20
began.
58, what's 23 from 58? 35. I was 35 here.
Okay, but the astronaut program began in the 50s? Is
That's
that when
right.
it started?
Uh-huh.
And so,
Anyhow, he's got his spurs on. I have some in there.
yeah, I saw those last time I was here.
Oh, here's one of the other guys that was in Germany with us after World War II. He flew the Starfighter too. That's what that's called. They'd come and spend the weekend. Shorty Powers and some others. Best cook for them. And they were sleeping all over the place.
Great memories.
Yeah.
Good
He'll be there.
memories. So you're going next weekend?
Yeah. Next weekend. Week from this one.
Now, what kind of reunion is that? Just some of you getting together, or is it a particular organization?
They've been having them since 1945.
Oh, okay.
It's the 86th Fighter Group.
Oh, okay.
And he was in the 526, no, he was the 525th at one time. And I was the commander of the 525th Squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in it, same one. But they had 2 other squadrons, and they were people from that will be there also, and from group headquarters. So that's basically it.
Well, they're great. I want to, if...
Ate coconuts on this island. And,
Oh, I bet you did.
This is my outfit right here. See?
Let me scan that,
And
too.
this is me.
That's a good picture.
And this too, I think.
That's a good picture. And then I definitely want to scan that, Fireball
Okay.
Bessie.
This one or this one?
I think this is the better one, because
All
you
right.
see you're so young. I mean, you were just a kid in this
know.
plane.
Well, I was, you know, I had, at that age, I had, I guess, about 1,600 hours.
Oh, my goodness.
Most guys went over 350. And I like to fly. I just flew like mad.
I can
I
tell
averaged
you
about
like
80
to fly.
hours a month in states before I went over. And
Those are others of this, but this
Yeah.
is the one I
Mhm.
want to copy. I think they were really impressed with that. I think that's what they'll use in the video.
yeah, okay.